When Albert Anastasia proposed making Luciano boss of bosses, and Luciano accepted, Anastasia felt like he was untouchable. But the truth was, he had never learned how to play second fiddle. Even as a Mangano underboss, he was always undermining the brothers, doing things his own way, checking every order meant for him with Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Stefano Magaddino, or Frank Scalise. It drove the Manganos nuts. They knew Anastasia was a wild card. He stuck his nose into other people's business, said whatever came into his head, and exploded when he felt like it. Nobody ever called him on it, and the Manganos knew why. The guy was too dangerous to cross. Costello watched it all, wary. He knew about the bad blood between Vito Genovese and Luciano down in Cuba, and he had a strong sense that Genovese was looking for new friends. The Manganos felt it too. They started to hate Anastasia and were weighing the possibility of teaming up with Genovese to take him out. But that was a move that could shatter the whole balance of the mob, and Anastasia understood that. At the same time, the world was shifting. Luciano was in Italy, cut off from New York, a deported boss with limited moves. Anastasia knew he was at war. Whatever alliances he had left, he needed to protect. Meanwhile, tensions between him and the Manganos kept rising. Anastasia started looking down on the brothers like they were nothing, nobodies he could wipe out with a snap of his fingers. The Bonanno family wouldn't stand in his way. The Gallianos wouldn't either. Everyone knew that if things came to a head, the ultimate decision would land with Luciano. And Anastasia was confident he had that in the bag. But those closer to the action could read the room. Meyer Lansky, making a quiet trip to Italy, met with Luciano in Taormina. Lansky was a man on the run himself, dodging the K-Forva committee hearings, but he came to update Luciano about New York. He brought his new wife Thelma, and when Luciano met her, he smiled and said, "I'm not the gangster she might have heard about." She was pleasant enough, but as far as Luciano was concerned, she was no match for Igea. Lansky came with more serious news. The gambling rackets were doing well. New bank accounts were being set up in Switzerland for Joe Adonis and a trusted ally, Batista. But he also laid out the shifting alliances in New York. Vito and Carlo Gambino, Lansky said. They're making it look like they're at odds, but under the table, they're tight as two fingers. That got Luciano thinking. He understood Genovese was a threat, but Gambino was the one that worried him. The quiet Sicilian had worked his way up to be a powerful captain under Mangano. Scalise was with him. The brothers, Phil and Vincent, were still bosses on paper, but Gambino was making moves. Lansky put it plain. It wouldn't be long before Anastasia took out the Manganos and claimed the top spot. A year later, it happened. In 1951, Phil Mangano was murdered, and Vincent disappeared. Anastasia rose to boss of the family, but Lansky had warned Luciano about more than just that. The real threat came from Gambino. 6 years later, in 1957, Anastasia was gunned down in a Manhattan barbershop. The era was shifting fast. The old bosses were falling, and the young wolves were rising. Luciano watched it happen from afar and understood what it meant. As soon as that happened, he said, I knew Carlo was going to get ambitious. Lansky came to me, and we sent a message back. We told Vito and Carlo to cut it out, that I wouldn't sit still for any moves on Anastasia, and I sent a private word to Gambino. I told him, you're one of the best leaders in New York. In 10-15 years, you can run it all. Just keep your pecker down and be patient. That slowed things down, at least for a while. For a moment it worked. But in the long run, the 60s would bury the old bosses, and men like Carlo Gambino would rise to redefine the mob. In that shift, the world Luciano had built would disappear, making way for a new era he could only watch from afar. By 1951, Carlo Gambino had started thinking bigger. The scraps weren't enough anymore. The Mangano brothers, Vincent and Philip, had to go. They weren't just bosses, they were relics. Old-world Palermitani with deep ties and long memories. But the new order was rising, and Gambino was done playing second fiddle. Frank Costello had reshaped the Luciano family. Costello was the boss now, the man at the top of the biggest crime family in New York. Luciano was still the emperor in exile, making decisions from afar. Joe Bonanno had claimed his spot, as had Joe Profaci. Even Tommy Lucchese, with the quiet death of Tommy Galliano in February 1951, was announced as boss. Galliano had been buried discreetly, a ghost of a funeral that spoke volumes. The era of the old guard was waning. Gambino watched it all with a calculating eye. So did Albert Anastasia. They knew the Mangano family was the biggest prize left in the city. The Manganos commanded loyalty. Tough men, sharp captains, made guys who didn't forget their heritage. Anastasia could never run it alone. Too many made men, too much pride. But that was fine for Gambino. All he needed was Anastasia to crack the door open. He'd slip in later. Frank Scalise had thrown in with Gambino and Costello. Scalise knew the temperature was rising. Anastasia was already leaning into other crews' rackets, brushing too close for comfort. The Manganos started grumbling, but Gambino was the one whispering in the ears, nudging Anastasia to move. Meanwhile, Anastasia felt the walls closing in. The hearings were heating up. Old murders were being dredged from the depths, names thrown out. Joe Adonis was being called to explain inconsistencies in his birth certificate. In New York, no skeleton stayed buried for long. Anastasia felt it. The Manganos weren't the kind to walk quietly into the night. They could hand him to the authorities to save themselves, just like Luciano had done with Lepke and Waxy Gordon. The thought of disappearing like that gnawed at him. It made him reckless. It made him paranoid. The tension was palpable. Everyone felt it. The Manganos felt it too. Then came the arrest of Jack, the dandy Parisi, a relic of the old murder-for-hire gang. Parisi had been a ghost for 10 years, a veteran of the brutal docks and longshore rackets. In '39, he gunned down Morris Diamond, an AFL Teamsters official, in a hail of bullets. Now he was back in cuffs, dragged from a hidden lair in Pennsylvania, where he'd been living like a retired prince. They found him in a one-room custom-built hideout, a private suite in the hills of Hazleton. Neat, expensive, tailored for a man who knew how to disappear. But Parisi didn't flinch. Even in cuffs he was sharp. Grey pinstripes, a green sport shirt, a watch and a diamond-studded chain worth a year's salary. When the detectives pulled $1,731 in cash from his pockets, he shrugged. They gave him enough for a sandwich and a cup of coffee. The rest went to the evidence locker. Parisi had been part of the Grand Council, the clandestine Mafia high table. The same group that set the rules and divided the spoils. Its roster read like a murderer's directory. The Mangano brothers, Profaci, Trainer, Palozzi from Cleveland, Magadino from Niagara, Rica from Chicago. Its chairman was Vincent Mangano. Its meetings were held far from New York, in Cleveland, away from prying eyes. But New York was changing, and the old names weren't safe anymore. The walls were closing in on the Manganos. Gambino felt it. Anastasia felt it too. The only question left was who would make the first move. What made things even more dangerous was the fact that Senator Kiefer was starting to investigate. Digging into some of the most famous and infamous gangsters around, everybody would be called to testify, and Anastasia's hands and fate would be put into the hands of the Manganals. If Anastasia became a risk, the Manganus would have enough cause to have him eliminated. And that's when Anastasia's heart started racing and started thinking. Maybe the Mangonels needed to be killed. Each article, each newspaper connecting Anastasia to a murder, or the Manganos to a racket, just made things worse. By the early 50s, the Brooklyn waterfront was its own kingdom, a sprawling racket built on brute force and desperation. The longshoremen weren't just working for a paycheck. They were working to stay alive. Miles McDonald, the hard-charging Brooklyn district attorney, had started pulling threads from that world, and what he found was a chokehold, a loan shark syndicate working hand-in-hand with union bosses and dock captains, extracting 300% interest from men already living hand-to-mouth. If a longshoreman owed money, he got first crack at a shift. The loan sharks made sure of it. They worked with union chiefs and foremen, backed by strong-arm crews of ex-gunmen and degenerate hoods, old Adonis shooters, Vincent Mangano loyalists, and the last remnants of the Little Augie Pisano gang. These weren't just neighborhood tough guys. They were Murder, Inc. alumni, men like Anthony Romeo, Jack Parisi, and the brothers Mangano. Men who treated the docks like their personal ATM. MacDonald knew what he was dealing with. Even as Adonis and Anastasia started to fade from the scene, Vincent Mangano refused to walk away. He had tried to make a play at a Chicago racetrack and lost badly, swallowing a beating from the Thoroughbred Association. The loss only tightened his grip on the piers between the Brooklyn Bridge and 52nd Street. In the salad days of Adonis, this had been his turf. Now, with the big names gone or under scrutiny, Mangano stepped forward, retaking command of the racket. Gerolimo Momo Mangano, Vincent's brother, was right there with him, skimming kickbacks from the docks, working the piers, making sure every dollar ended up in the family till. Philip Mangano, another brother, had a long record too. Murder in 1923, extortion 10 years later. This was the family that dominated the harbour. MacDonald and the cops weren't chasing ghosts anymore. They had names, they had books, they had evidence. The district attorney announced a top-to-bottom review of every waterfront firm that had been bleeding for the mob. Subpoenas started going out. Payroll records, ledger books, cancelled checks, every piece of paper that connected the firms to the gangs. The goal was simple: drag the racket into the light and dismantle it piece by piece. It didn't end at the piers. The stink rose higher, closer to City Hall and the precinct houses. As MacDonald pushed harder, a veteran Brooklyn detective, William Garvey, found himself in the spotlight. Garvey had 24 years on the force, 3 commendations, and a reputation for doing the job. But when a $500 payoff surfaced, a bribe meant to bury a stabbing case, Garvey retired quietly, putting in his papers before the grand jury called him in. It was the first sign that the investigation was shaking the walls of the police department itself. Then came the Profaci threads. Joseph Profaci, the olive oil kingpin from Brooklyn, had long wrapped himself in the guise of a religious businessman, a soft-spoken man in a modest office, adorned with holy icons. To outsiders, Profaci was a picture of respectability. To the cops and the feds, he was a boss, a player, one of the Mafia's Grand Council. In 1928, he'd been collared in Cleveland when the cops raided a Mafia summit, an event that nearly changed the shape of organized crime. The room had been packed, 50 men from across the country. Someone tipped the bosses, and half of them bolted before the doors came down. Profaci was one of the unlucky ones, booked and later released. Since then, Profaci had turned into the picture of a civic-minded businessman. But Denver cops weren't buying the holy routine. They called him one of the sharpest operators in the mob, a man worth well over $1 million, a man with olive oil trucks that masked a very different commodity. Just that spring, Profaci's company was fined $12,000 in a federal court for selling peanut oil as olive oil, a scheme as bold and calculated as any strong-arm he pulled on the docks. To MacDonald, Profaci was a link in a long, bloody chain, a quiet, calculating boss whose hands weren't as clean as his reputation. The inquiry was growing, names piling up, threads intertwining. And in the smoky backrooms of Brooklyn and Manhattan, the bosses felt the pressure. They knew the walls were starting to move. By early 1951, the walls weren't just closing in on the mob, they were shaking. The Senate hearings under Kefauver were about to drag the Mafia out of the smoky back rooms and into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The underworld was groggy from the blows it had already taken, and this was shaping up to be the biggest one of all. Rudolph Halley, the committee's sharp-eyed chief counsel, made it plain to reporters. Some of the biggest names in the Mafia weren't the ones making noise in the papers. They were ghosts, bosses and shot callers who lived like paupers in cold water flats and walk-ups because that was how you stayed invisible. They honor that way of life, Halley said. They might ride in expensive cars, but they want people to think they're broke. He promised a witness list that read like an underworld census. Vincent Mangano, Joe Profaci, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky, Tommy Lucchese, Anthony Anastasia, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Lucky Luciano. The big names and the quiet ones. The committee was looking for Edward McGrath too, a waterfront strongman and brother-in-law of John Cockeye Dunn, and chasing down Irving Sherman, a Manhattan manufacturer linked to the docks. Names that once inspired whispers started filling ledgers. The Internal Revenue Service announced a priority investigation into 1,700 underworld figures, 374 of them flagged for $34 million in taxes and penalties. The files weren't a list. They were an obituary for the era of invincibility. The names came in waves, a grim drumbeat: Sam Accardi, Tony Accardo, Joe Adonis, Joe Albano, Vincent Allo, the Angasola brothers, Fred, George and John, from Cleveland, Ray Arend of Minneapolis, Dominic Brancato, and John Borsia from Chicago, William Block, Sidney Brown working New York and Florida, the Capones, John, Matthew and Ralph, from Chicago, Frank Carbo in New York, Anthony Carfano, splitting time between New York and Florida, Jerry Katina out of New Jersey, Joe Chiarello of New York, Nick Cicella of Chicago, the Civettas, Carlo, Romeo and Tony, from Cleveland, Mickey Cohen in Los Angeles, Joe Colucci, Louis Campagna, Albert Contento of New York, Michael Coppola, Joe Korngold, Frank Costello, Morris Dalitz works in Cleveland and Detroit, Philip D'Andrea of Chicago, Alex and Tony DeBellis of New York, Angelo DiCarlo, Roy and Sam DiCarlo down in Miami, Rocco DiGrazio in Chicago, Nick Delmore and Anthony De Laredo of New York and Chicago, Paul DeLucia of Chicago, Frank Diamond, Marty Dubin, Frank Erickson and Fred Evand of New York, Tom Philbin in St. Paul, the Fischiettis, Charles, Joe and Rocco in Chicago, Joe Fusco, Vito Genovese, Mooney Giancana working Chicago, Eddie Ginsberg covering Los Angeles and New York. The Chicago contingent: Charles Gaio, Dave Glass, Alex Glickman, Anthony Guarino, Marty Guifoyle and Jack Guzik. Willie Heaney. Arthur Herbert works in New York and Los Angeles, Cappy Hoffman in Philadelphia, Murray Humphreys and Sam Hunt in Chicago, Phil Castell in New Orleans, Phil Katz and David Krakauer in New York, Marty Krompier in New York, Jack Lansky in Miami, Meyer Lansky and Joe Panzer in New York, Jaime Leven in Chicago, William Lias out of Wheeling, West Virginia, Pete Licavoli works in Detroit and Tucson, Frank Livorsi in New York, Marcus Looney in Chicago, Claude Maddox in Chicago, Philip and Vincent Mangano in New York, Frank Marcellus works in New Orleans, Joe Massey down in Miami, Harold Meltzer in Los Angeles, Sam Miller in Cleveland, Leo Mongovan out of Chicago, the Moretti brothers, Quavo and Salvatore, in New Jersey, George Nidich and Dominio Nuccio in New York, John Oddo, William O'Donnell and Leonard Patrick in Chicago, Ralph Pierce working the Windy City, Herman Pincus of New York, Al Polizzi out of Cleveland, Giuseppe Profaci in New York, Joe Rao and Michael Ravci in Chicago, Marco Reginelli straddling Philadelphia and Camden, Joe Reinfeld working New Jersey. Anthony Ricci in New York. Morris Reusner in St. Paul. John Roselli works in Chicago and Los Angeles. Harry Rosenberg in New York. James Rutkin out of New Jersey. Frank Ryan works in Chicago. Mo Sedway running Las Vegas. Irving Sherman and Harry Cyperstein in New York. Mike Sprans out of Chicago. Anthony Strallo works in New York and New Jersey. Larry Stromberg of New York. Sam Harry Tarrant working Miami and St. Paul. Charles Tureen straddling New York and New Jersey. Eddie Vogel in Chicago. Anthony Volpe works in New York and New Jersey. William Weisberg in Philadelphia. Irving Wexler in New York. Longy Zwillman out of New York. Some of the names may not have been spelt correctly, as well as all the may not have been there. The locations they controlled may not have been right, but that list was printed in March 1951, as you heard it, and it was pretty close to who was active around that time. A few names were absent, Carlo Gambino being one of them. However, it was a holy roll call of the mob. The names that shaped a generation of rackets, the men who pulled the strings and lived in the spaces between the laws. The era when these names could stay hidden was gone. The hearings would crack the dam, and every boss, every fixer, every made man felt the pressure. In New York, in Miami, in Chicago, from the ports of New Orleans to the smoky card rooms of Cleveland, the underworld held its breath. The long night was ending. The morning was coming. And in the silence between the names, every boss could hear the sound of a door kicking down.